My sister kept telling everyone at family gatherings that my baby wasn't my husband's child as a cruel joke. She went pale when I made her answer for her funny crime. When our daughter Nora was born, she had the brightest blue eyes anyone had ever seen. Neither my husband Wesley nor I have blue eyes. I'm brown-eyed. He's brown-eyed too, but my mother had blue eyes. And Wesley's father did too. The pediatrician said it was completely normal. It happens all the time when both parents quietly carry the recessive gene. Everyone understood this except my sister Vivian. At Nora's first family gathering when she was 3 weeks old, Vivian took one look at her and said, "Well, we know what happened here." While winking at everyone, I asked what she meant. She laughed and said, "Blue eyes don't come from nowhere. Maybe I had some explaining to do." Wesley's face went tight, but he stayed quiet. My mom told Vivian to stop being ridiculous. Vivian said she was just joking. Couldn't anyone take a joke anymore? But she didn't stop. Every single family event, Vivian would make comments. At my nephew's birthday, she asked Wesley if he wanted a paternity test for Christmas. At Easter, she told my cousin that Nora looked just like the man who lived next door. At the 4th of July barbecue, she asked me in front of 15 relatives if I wanted to confess anything. Each time, she'd laugh and say she was kidding. But Wesley stopped coming to family events after the 3rd time. He said he couldn't listen to it anymore. My mother-in-law heard about Vivian's jokes from my cousin. She started asking questions. Was Wesley sure? Had we considered testing? She never said these things to me, only to Wesley. He told me she was concerned about him being naive. His brother started making comments too, subtle at first, then more direct, asking Wesley if he noticed Nora didn't have his chin, pointing out she had light eyes when both Wesley and I were dark-eyed. Wesley started looking at Nora differently. Not with suspicion exactly, but with questions. He'd stare at her face during feeding time, compare her baby pictures to his own. One night, I caught him looking up DNA testing websites on his phone. He said he was just curious about ancestry stuff. Vivian thought she was being hilarious. So, at Thanksgiving, she brought a DNA kit as a gift, wrapped it in baby paper with a card that said, "For when you're ready for the truth." She announced to the whole table what it was. She said every family needed honesty. Wesley walked out, left me there with our baby and 20 relatives staring at us. I followed him to the car. He was crying. He said he hated himself for doubting me. But the constant jokes were getting to him. He said maybe we should do the test just to shut everyone up. I said if he needed a test after 4 years together and a planned pregnancy, then we had bigger problems than Vivian. We went home without eating dinner. Vivian texted me that night, saying Wesley was too sensitive and couldn't handle a little teasing. She said that if I had nothing to hide, I wouldn't be so defensive. I didn't respond, but she kept going. She posted old pictures on Facebook of blue-eyed actors with captions like Nora's real daddy. She tagged me in articles about eye color genetics with laughing emojis and comments like, "Sure, whatever you say." She started a group chat with female relatives asking if anyone else thought it was suspicious. My cousin told me Vivian was placing actual bets on when Wesley would leave me. That group chat turned out to be worse than I imagined. One of the cousins who was in it felt guilty and forwarded me screenshots. In them, Vivian had written that she'd known something was off since the pregnancy, that I'd been distant around a certain coworker of mine, that she was only saying out loud what everyone was already thinking. None of it was true. I'd never been close to any coworker, and I'd been on bed rest for the last 2 months of the pregnancy. But she said it with such confidence that some of the relatives in the chat started agreeing, adding their own little observations, building a whole fake story out of nothing. Reading those screenshots made me feel like I was standing outside my own life watching strangers narrate it. At my nephew's christening in the spring, Vivian cornered Wesley by the coat rack while I was feeding Nora. He didn't tell me what she said until weeks later, but she'd leaned in close and asked him quietly if he really wanted to spend his whole life raising another man's kid. Wesley said he'd walk day without answering, but the question stuck in him like a splinter. At a family wedding that summer, Vivian raised a glass during the reception and made a toast that started out normal, and then ended with a line about how you never really know whose kids are whose these days, staring right at me while she said it. A few people laughed uncomfortably. Most just looked down at their plates. I sat there with my face burning, while Wesley's grip on my hand went tight under the table. On Halloween, she mailed Nora a costume. It was a little mailman outfit, complete with a tiny bag and a hat. And the card said, "Every kid should dress up as someone in the family." I threw it in the trash before Wesley could see it, but my hands were shaking so hard I could barely open the lid. She wasn't just making jokes anymore. She was running a campaign and she was patient about it, spacing the cruelty out so that just when things felt calm, another comment or gift or post would land and knock the ground out from under us again. Wesley and I started fighting about things that had nothing to do with Vivian, snapping at each other over dishes and bedtimes, and whose turn it was to get up with the baby. I didn't realize until later that we were fighting because we were both carrying the same poison and had nowhere to put it. My mom kept telling me to just rise above it, that Vivian had always been like this, that reacting would only give her what she wanted. So, I stayed quiet. I smiled through the comments. I told myself that if I never gave her a reaction, she'd eventually get bored and stop. But she never got bored. Every family event became something I dreaded for weeks in advance, lying awake wondering what she'd say this time, whether Wesley would come or make an excuse to stay home. And every time I stayed quiet, I could feel a little more of my marriage getting eaten away, and a little more of my own patience burning down to nothing. The breaking point came at Nora's first birthday party. We'd only invited close family, made it clear Vivian wasn't welcome. She showed up anyway, brought a gift. When Nora opened it in front of everyone, it was a onesie with a big question mark where the word daddy should have been, and underneath it said, "Still waiting on results." The room went silent. Wesley stood up, took Nora, and walked to our bedroom. I heard the door lock. Vivian was laughing, saying we needed to lighten up, that she'd bought it as a gag gift, that everyone was too uptight these days. That's when I lost it. I told her she was a miserable woman who destroyed relationships for entertainment, that her 2 divorces made sense now, that even her own kids barely spoke to her, and everyone knew why. She said I was being dramatic over a little joke. I said her joke was destroying my marriage. She said if my marriage was that weak, it deserved to be destroyed. My mom tried to intervene, but I wasn't done. I announced to everyone that Vivian had been spreading rumors for a year, that she'd placed bets on my marriage ending, that she'd made Wesley so paranoid he was looking at DNA tests, that this wasn't humor, it was cruelty. Vivian tried to leave, but I followed her to the door. I told her if she ever contacted us again, ever made another joke, ever mentioned my daughter's eyes, I'd tell everyone what she did to Dad while he was dying. Her face went white. Vivian's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to find words, but nothing came out. The living room behind me had gone completely silent, not even the sound of someone shifting their weight or clearing their throat. I could feel every single relative staring at us, watching this moment play out like they were frozen in place. Vivian's hand gripped the doorframe and her knuckles went white against the wood. She tried to force a laugh, that same high-pitched sound she always made after her jokes, but it came out shaky and wrong. She waved her hand at me like I was being silly and said something about how I was being so dramatic over nothing. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she took a step backward onto the front porch. I followed her and spoke loud enough that everyone inside could hear me clearly through the open door. I said we could discuss Dad's missing $38,000 right here in front of everyone if that's what she wanted. I asked if she'd like to explain how Dad's signature appeared on checks during his last 6 months of hospice, when his hand shook so bad he couldn't even hold a fork. Vivian's face went from white to red, and she shook her head fast while backing down the porch steps. She said I was a liar and I was making things up to hurt her. I took another step forward and told her I had copies of every single forged check and the fake beneficiary form locked in my safe. She turned and practically ran to her car, fumbling with her keys and dropping them twice before getting the door open. Her tires squealed when she backed out of the driveway, and I watched her taillights disappear down the street before I turned around. My mother was standing right behind me when I walked back inside. She grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the kitchen, while everyone else stood around pretending they weren't staring. Mom's face was tight and her voice came out in a harsh whisper, asking me what I was talking about with Dad's money. I leaned against the kitchen counter and told her the whole story. 2 years ago, when I was helping clean out Dad's office after the funeral, I found a folder of bank statements in the back of his filing cabinet. The statement showed checks and transfers written during the last 6 months of his life, all made out to Vivian or moved into her account totaling over $38,000. I'd sat with Dad during those months. I'd watched him try to sign a birthday card for Nora and give up because his hands shook too hard to make the letters. I told Mom I'd compared the signatures on the checks to Dad's real signature from before he got sick, and they didn't match at all. I told her I'd also found a beneficiary change form for his life insurance, dated 3 weeks before he died, moving everything to Vivian and cutting you out completely. And that signature didn't match either. Mom's hand went to her mouth and she asked why I never said anything. I explained that Dad had just died and everyone was falling apart and fighting over money felt wrong when we'd just buried him. I said I kept the copies just in case, but hoped I'd never need them. Mom closed her eyes and took a deep breath before saying she believed me, and she was sorry I'd been carrying that secret alone for 2 years. When we walked back to the living room, people were already gathering their things and heading for the door. Nobody looked at me directly. They all found reasons to study their phones, or check on their kids, or remember something they left in their car. The whole party cleared out in less than 20 minutes, with people making awkward excuses about early mornings and long drives. My cousin Paige was one of the last ones to leave, and she pulled me into a tight hug before she walked out. She whispered right in my ear that it was about time someone stood up to Vivian. She said she was sorry she didn't say something sooner, that she should have told me about the betting pool weeks ago instead of waiting. I hugged her back and told her I understood and I wasn't mad at her. She squeezed my hand once more before heading out to her car. The house felt strange and quiet after everyone left with half-eaten cake on plates and decorations still hanging everywhere. I walked down the hallway to our bedroom and knocked softly on the door. I said everyone was gone, and it was just us now. The lock clicked, and Wesley opened the door slowly, moving carefully like he didn't want to wake the baby. Nora was asleep on his shoulder, with her little hand curled against his neck, and her dark hair sticking up in every direction. Wesley's eyes were red and puffy, and I could see tear tracks on his cheeks. He didn't say anything, just stepped back to let me in before closing the door behind us. We sat on the bed next to each other, not touching at first, just watching Nora sleep between us on the blanket. Her chest moved up and down with tiny breaths, and she made little sounds in her sleep. Wesley and I sat there for what felt like forever, neither of us knowing what to say or how to start. Finally, he spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. He said he was sorry for doubting me, sorry for letting Vivian's poison get into his head, sorry for not defending me better to his own family. I told him I was sorry, too. Sorry I let it go on so long before I fought back. Sorry I didn't shut Vivian down the first time she made a joke. We sat in silence for another few minutes before Wesley reached over and took my hand. That night, after we put Nora in her crib and turned on her nightlight, Wesley sat on the edge of our bed and told me something that made my stomach drop. He said he'd actually made an appointment for a DNA test next week at a lab downtown. His voice shook when he talked, and he couldn't look at me. He said he felt disgusted with himself for even considering it. But Vivian's constant comments had gotten so deep into his head that he couldn't stop the doubts from creeping in. He said he'd lie awake at night, looking at Nora's blue eyes and wondering, hating himself for wondering, but unable to stop. He told me he'd been planning to go alone without telling me, just to get the test done and prove to himself that he was being crazy. I sat down next to him and put my hand on his back. I told him I understood why he felt that way, and I wasn't angry at him. I said if taking the test would give him peace and kill the doubts Vivian planted, then we should do it together. Wesley's face crumpled and he started crying, really crying in a way I'd never seen before. He put his head in his hands and his whole body shook. He said he didn't want to be the kind of husband who needed proof. Didn't want to be the kind of father who looked at his daughter and questioned if she was really his. He said he loved Nora more than anything in the world, and he hated that Vivian had made him doubt something he knew in his heart was true. I held him while he cried and told him it was okay, that we'd get through this together. We talked for another hour about what to do, and finally decided together that we'd do the DNA test, not because either of us actually doubted the results, but because we needed to kill the poison Vivian had planted once and for all. We needed something concrete that Wesley could look at when the doubts crept in at night, something that would shut down any future comments from anyone. Wesley got his laptop and ordered a home test kit right there, paying extra for rush processing so we'd get results in 3 to 5 days instead of 2 weeks. We both felt sick about needing to do it, but also relieved that we'd finally have proof we could point to. My phone rang early the next morning while I was making coffee. Mom's name showed up on the screen, and I almost didn't answer, but I figured I should get it over with. She started talking before I even said hello, her voice tight and exhausted. She said Vivian had been blowing up her phone since last night, claiming I was trying to destroy her reputation with lies. Vivian was telling everyone in the family that I'd made up the whole story about Dad's money to get revenge for a few harmless jokes. Mom's voice got quiet and serious when she asked me point blank if the theft was real or if I just said it to hurt Vivian. I took a deep breath and told her yes. It was completely real, and I had copies of all the forged checks and the fake beneficiary form in my safe deposit box at the bank. I said I could show them to her anytime she wanted to see proof. An hour later, my phone rang again, and my Uncle Roland's name showed up. He was Dad's younger brother, and I picked up, and he didn't even say hello, just asked why I never told anyone about the theft. His voice sounded tight and angry in a way I'd never heard from him before. I took a breath and explained that Dad had just died when I found those forged checks. Everyone was grieving and falling apart. I didn't want to tear the whole family into pieces over money when we'd already lost him. The funeral had been hard enough without adding accusations and police reports. Roland went quiet for a minute, and I could hear him breathing on the other end. Then he said he understood I was trying to protect everyone, but Vivian had been using my silence like a shield to hurt my family for a whole year. He told me he was going to help Mom handle Vivian now, and I should just focus on fixing things with Wesley. He said not to worry about the family drama anymore because he and Mom would take care of it. We hung up, and I sat there staring at my phone, feeling weird about the whole thing. Part of me felt relieved that Roland believed me and was stepping in. Another part felt guilty for keeping the theft quiet for so long. That afternoon, My phone rang again, and this time it was Denise, Wesley's mom. My stomach dropped when I saw her name because I figured she was calling to yell at me or defend Vivian somehow. But when I answered, her voice sounded small and shaky. She said she needed to apologize for questioning Wesley about paternity. She told me she realized now that she let Vivian's gossip get into her head and change how she saw things. She said she was ashamed that she doubted her own son and made him feel like he needed to prove something. She kept saying she was sorry over and over. I told her it was okay and that I understood how Vivian's constant comments could mess with people's heads. We talked for a few more minutes, and she asked if she could come visit Nora soon. I said yes because I could tell she really meant the apology. My phone buzzed with a text from Wesley's brother, Grant, about 20 minutes after I got off the call with Denise. The text was long and said he wanted to apologize for his comments about Nora's features. He admitted he was just repeating stuff he'd heard other family members saying at gatherings. He wrote that he never actually believed any of it and felt terrible for joining in. He said he should have stood up for us instead of making Wesley feel worse. I texted back that I appreciated him saying that, and it took guts to admit he was wrong. 2 days later, we did the DNA test. Wesley opened the kit at the kitchen table, while Nora played with locks on the floor. The instructions said to swab the inside of the cheek for 30 seconds. Wesley did his first, rubbing the long cotton swab against the inside of his mouth while watching the timer on his phone. Then I held Nora still while he did hers, which was harder because she kept trying to grab the swab and bite it. We got enough cells, though, and sealed both swabs in their separate tubes. The kit came with a prepaid shipping envelope, and we walked to the post office right away to send it overnight. The woman behind the counter scanned it and said it would arrive the next day. The waiting period was 3 to 5 business days after they got it. Walking back to the car, Wesley grabbed my hand and squeezed it hard. Neither of us said anything, but I knew we were both thinking the same thing. Every hour was going to feel like torture, even though we both knew what the results would say. Those days were some of the strangest of my life. On the surface, nothing changed. I still fed Nora and changed her and rocked her to sleep. Wesley still went to work and came home. But underneath the normal routine, we were both counting hours, both pretending we weren't. I caught him checking the tracking number on the envelope 3 times in one afternoon. He caught me staring at Nora's face while she slept. Not with doubt, but with a kind of fierce protectiveness, like I was memorizing every feature so I could throw it back in Vivian's face. Neither of us could really relax. The test was supposed to be a formality, a way to shut everyone up. But the waiting had a way of making even certainty feel fragile. One night, Wesley admitted he was scared. Not that the result would be bad, but that even after it came back the way we knew it would, he wouldn't be able to unveil the months he'd spent doubting. He said the doubt had changed something in him, and he didn't know if a piece of paper could change it back. I told him I didn't know either, but that we'd find out together and that whatever the paper said, I wasn't going anywhere. We held on to each other in the dark, and didn't say much after that. During the day, the phone kept ringing. Relatives who'd heard about the blow-up at the party called to get the story. Some of them genuinely concerned, some of them just hungry for details. I got good at telling the short version and getting off the phone quickly. The ones who mattered, the ones who'd actually stood by me, didn't ask for the story at all. They just asked how I was doing and whether I needed anything. Paige dropped off groceries twice that week without being asked. Roland texted me every morning just to say he was thinking of us. Those small gestures meant more than any of the dramatic phone calls because they came from people who wanted nothing from me except to know I was okay. It was during those quiet days of waiting that I started to see the family sorting itself into 2 groups. The people who showed up and the people who watched. And once you see that line, you can never unsee it. 3 days into the waiting period, I got an email notification on my phone. Vivian's name popped up in my inbox, and my hand started shaking before I even opened it. The email was long, maybe 10 paragraphs, and she called me vindictive and cruel in the first sentence. She claimed the money situation was just a misunderstanding, that Dad had wanted her to have it, and she was only helping manage his accounts because he asked her to. She wrote that I'd always been jealous of her close relationship with Dad, and that's why I was making up lies now. She said I was a terrible person for destroying family bonds over a joke that was meant to be funny. The email went on and on about how I was too sensitive and couldn't handle teasing. She accused me of turning everyone against her because I wanted attention and sympathy. By the end, she was saying I'd regret using lies to hurt her. I read it twice and felt my face getting hot with anger. I didn't write back to Vivian. Instead, I just hit the forward button and sent the whole email to Mom and Roland without adding any comments. Roland replied in less than 5 minutes. His message said they'd already contacted the estate lawyer that morning, and they were pursuing legal action against Vivian. He wrote that Vivian was no longer welcome at any family gathering, and he'd made that clear to everyone. He told me to block her number and email so she couldn't contact me anymore. I did exactly that. The next day, Paige called while I was folding laundry. She asked how I was holding up after everything that happened at the party. I told her I was okay, just waiting on the DNA results, and trying not to think about Vivian. Paige got quiet for a second, and then said she needed to tell me something. She revealed that Vivian had actually gotten 5 other relatives to put money into the betting pool about my marriage ending. She listed their names, and I felt sick hearing some of them, because they were people I thought liked me. Paige said she refused to participate when Vivian asked her to join. She told me she'd even argued with Vivian about how wrong it was, but she didn't tell me before because she thought I already had enough stress. I thanked her for telling me now, and for not joining in. After we hung up, I sat on the couch for a while, just processing the fact that 6 people in my family had been betting money on my marriage falling apart. Day 4 of waiting arrived, and I was feeding Nora breakfast in her high chair when Wesley came into the kitchen holding an envelope. His face looked pale, and his hands were shaking slightly. He said the results came in the mail. I put down Nora's spoon and watched him open the envelope slowly, like he was scared of what might be inside, even though we knew. He pulled out the paper and stared at it for what felt like a full minute without moving. Then he turned it around to show me. The paper had official letterhead at the top and a bunch of technical language I didn't understand. But right in the middle, in bold letters, it said 99.9% probability of paternity. Wesley's eyes filled up with tears, and so did mine. We just stood there in the kitchen crying while Nora banged her plastic spoon on her tray and babbled at us. Wesley came over and hugged me so hard I could barely breathe. Neither of us said anything for a long time. That afternoon, Wesley disappeared into the garage for about an hour. When he came back in, he was holding a simple black frame he'd bought at the store. He'd put the DNA results inside it. I asked him what he was doing, and he said he wanted to hang it in Nora's nursery. I thought that was kind of strange at first, like who frames a paternity test? But he explained that he wanted a reminder of how close he came to letting someone else's poison destroy his family. He said every time he walked into her room and saw that frame, he'd remember what we survived together and how we didn't let Vivian win. We hung it on the wall next to the growth chart, and Wesley stood there looking at it for a long time. I put my arm around his waist and leaned against him. The frame looked strange hanging there with all the cute baby decorations around it, but I understood why he needed it there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept getting up to look at the frame in the dark, the shape of it just visible in the glow of Nora's nightlight. I thought about how a single sheet of paper had the power to give my husband back to me, and how close we'd come to losing everything to a woman who thought her cruelty was comedy. I thought about Vivian sitting in her own house somewhere, probably telling herself she'd done nothing wrong. And I thought about Dad, and how he'd never know that the daughter he trusted with his checkbook had been robbing him blind while he wasted away. And how the other daughter had found out and said nothing for 2 years because she didn't want to shatter what was left of the family. The guilt of that silence had been sitting on my chest for so long that I'd stopped noticing it. The way you stop noticing a weight you've carried until someone finally takes it off you. Now that it was out, I felt lighter and heavier at the same time, relieved that the truth was finally moving and terrified of where it was going to land. The next morning, Wesley did something that surprised me. He called his mother and asked her to come over. When Denise arrived, he sat her down at our kitchen table and put the framed DNA result in front of her. He didn't say anything cruel. He just told her that he needed her to see it with her own eyes, because she'd let herself doubt him, and he wasn't going to let that doubt live in his mother's head for one more day. Denise looked at the paper for a long time, and then she started to cry. She said she was so sorry that she'd let Vivian's poison make her question her own son, and she'd never forgive herself for it. Wesley told her he forgave her, but that things had to be different now, that he needed his family to stand behind him instead of whispering behind his back. Denise nodded and said she understood, and she promised she'd spend the rest of her life proving it. Watching them, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, which was hope that the damage might actually be repairable, that the people who'd let us down might find their way back. Word about the DNA results spread through the family the way everything did, quietly and quickly. Paige told me later that when Vivian heard about it, she'd laughed it off and said a test could be faked, that I'd probably paid the lab to write whatever I wanted. It was so absurd that even her own supporters didn't buy it. That was the moment, Paige said, when some of the relatives who'd been on the fence finally stepped off it because they realized Vivian would never admit she was wrong about anything, no matter what proof was put in front of her. She'd rather accuse a laboratory of fraud than say she was sorry. Hearing that should have made me angry, but instead, it made me sad in a tired sort of way. My sister was the kind of person who would burn down the whole world before admitting she'd struck the first match, and no verdict or document or apology was ever going to change that. 2 days later, Mom called while I was doing dishes and asked if we'd come to Sunday dinner at her house. She said she needed to see us and promised Vivian wouldn't be there. Her voice sounded tired and sad when she told me she was heartbroken about everything that happened, but she believed me about Dad's money. She said I did the right thing. Finally, using that information to protect my family. I told her we'd come, and she sounded relieved. That Sunday, we drove to Mom's house with Nora in her car seat, babbling the whole way. Wesley seemed nervous and kept adjusting his grip on the steering wheel. When we walked in, about a dozen relatives were already there, sitting around the dining room table. Roland stood up as soon as he saw us and hugged me tight. Then he asked everyone to sit down because he and Mom had something important to say. The room got quiet and people stopped passing dishes around. Mom cleared her throat and announced that she'd filed a formal complaint with the police about the forged checks and the fake beneficiary form Vivian used to steal from Dad while he was dying. Several cousins gasped, and my aunt put her hand over her mouth, but another uncle nodded like he'd been expecting this, and Paige reached over to squeeze my hand under the table. Mom said she had copies of everything and the police were taking it seriously. She started crying quietly halfway through, and Roland put his hand on her shoulder while she finished. Wesley put his arm around my shoulders, and I could feel how tense he was. The next afternoon, I was folding laundry in the living room when my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I answered it, and heard a woman crying so hard she could barely talk. She said her name, and I realized it was Vivian's daughter calling me. She begged me to get Mom to drop the charges, and said her mother made a mistake, but didn't deserve to go to jail. I sat down on the couch because my legs felt shaky. I told her as gently as I could that it wasn't my decision to make. My mother filed the report, and it was out of my hands now. She kept crying and said her mom had problems, but she was still her mom. I said I understood that, but Vivian had a whole year to stop attacking my family, and she chose to keep going. Vivian's daughter said I was being cruel and hung up on me. I sat there holding the phone for a while, feeling sick to my stomach, even though I knew I'd done nothing wrong. That night, after Nora went to bed, Wesley and I were sitting on the couch watching TV when he muted it suddenly. He turned to me and said he thought we should start seeing a marriage counselor. My stomach dropped because I worried he was going to say he wanted a divorce. But he explained that the DNA test proved biology and genetics, but it didn't automatically fix the fact that he doubted me for months. He said those doubts did damage, and we needed help working through it. I felt relieved and scared at the same time. I told him I thought that was a good idea, and he squeezed my hand. He'd already looked up a few counselors who specialized in family issues and trust problems. We made an appointment for the following week. The first counseling session felt awkward from the moment we sat down on the therapist's couch. The counselor was a woman in her 50s who asked us to explain why we were there. Wesley started talking and admitted he felt ashamed of his doubts about Nora's paternity. His voice cracked when he said he hated himself for letting Vivian's poison get into his head. Then it was my turn, and I said I resented him for not defending me more strongly to his own family. I told the counselor I felt alone dealing with Vivian's attacks while Wesley stayed quiet or avoided family events. The counselor listened to both of us and said these were completely normal feelings after what we'd been through. She explained that trust damage takes time to heal, and we shouldn't expect everything to be fixed immediately just because we had proof. She gave us some exercises to do at home about communicating our feelings without blaming each other. When we left, I felt exhausted, but also a little hopeful. 2 weeks after the birthday party disaster, Wesley got a text from Vivian's husband, asking if we could all sit down and have a conversation. Wesley showed me the message and asked what I thought. I said, absolutely not, but it was his decision too. Wesley texted back that Vivian wasn't safe for our family right now, and we needed space. His hands were shaking while he typed it. Vivian's husband sent back a long message saying Vivian was struggling and felt terrible about everything. Wesley turned his phone off without responding. He told me he was done making excuses for people who hurt us. I hugged him and told him I was proud of him for setting that boundary. 3 days later, Roland called me in the middle of the afternoon, sounding angry. The estate lawyer had contacted him with new findings about Vivian's theft. She'd actually taken closer to $71,000 over those 6 months, not the $38,000 I'd originally found. The lawyer showed him bank records, proving Vivian had been systematically draining Dad's accounts while telling everyone she was just helping pay his medical bills. She'd forged Dad's signature on checks, set up electronic transfers to her own account, and forged the beneficiary change on a life insurance policy worth almost $40,000 on top of the cash. Roland said he felt sick knowing his own niece had stolen from his dying brother. He told me the police were treating it as a serious felony case now because of the amount. I didn't know what to say, so I just listened while he talked through his anger and sadness. Over the next few days, several relatives who'd been in Vivian's betting pool started sending me awkward apology texts. One cousin said she thought it was just a harmless joke and didn't realize how much damage it was causing. An aunt texted that she felt terrible and wanted to make it right. I read each message, but didn't respond to most of them. I was still too angry that they'd participated in something so cruel, even if they claimed they thought it was harmless. They'd been betting actual money on my marriage falling apart. Paige called to tell me she'd heard two of them were trying to get others to pressure me into accepting their apologies. I told her I'd forgive them when I was ready, and not before. She said that was completely fair, and she'd run interference if anyone bothered me about it. In the middle of all of this, the first anniversary of Dad's death arrived. Every year, the family gathered at his grave, and then went back to Mom's house for a quiet dinner, the way he would have wanted. This year, for the first time, Vivian wasn't there. I stood at the graveside with Nora on my hip and Wesley's arm around me, looking down at Dad's headstone, and I felt a grief that was different from the year before. Last year, I'd grieved the man. This year, I grieved the truth about what had happened to him in his final months. I thought about how he'd trusted Vivian, how he'd handed her his checkbook and his passwords because she was his firstborn, and he'd never imagined she could hurt him. I thought about the checks with his shaky forged signature, the transfers, moving his savings out of reach while he lay in a hospice bed believing his affairs were in order. I hadn't cried much through the whole ordeal. I'd been too busy fighting, too focused on holding my marriage together and protecting Nora. But standing at that grave, it all caught up with me at once, and I cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since the funeral. Wesley held me while Nora patted my face with her little hand, confused about why I was upset. Mom came and stood on my other side and put her arm through mine. She said she was sorry over and over, that she was sorry for Dad and sorry for me, and sorry it had taken her so long to see it. We stood there together, the 3 generations Vivian had tried to break, and we didn't break. Back at Mom's house, the dinner was subdued, but not sad exactly. People told stories about Dad, the good ones, the way he used to fall asleep in his chair during movies and swear he'd been watching the whole time. The way he'd taught all of us to fish and never once baited his own hook, because he said that was the grandkids' job. Nobody said Vivian's name. Her absence was its own kind of presence. A chair nobody sat in, a story nobody finished because it involved her. But there was also a kind of relief in the room, an ease that hadn't been there in years. Roland said it out loud at one point, quietly just to me. He said it was terrible that it took a crime to clear the air, but the air was clearer than it had been in a long time, and Dad would have wanted his family to be honest with each other, even if honesty came late and cost too much. I thought about that for a long time afterward. Dad had spent his whole life keeping the peace between his daughters, smoothing over Vivian's tempers and my resentments, and in the end, the peace he'd kept had let her rob him blind. Maybe Roland was right. Maybe the kindest thing I could do for Dad's memory was to stop keeping the kind of peace that protected the wrong people. That night, driving home with Nora asleep in the back seat, Wesley reached over and took my hand at a red light. He said he'd been thinking about how I'd carried the secret about Dad's money for 2 years alone while Vivian tormented us. And he said he understood now why I'd finally broken at the birthday party. He said a person can only hold that much for so long before it comes out one way or another. And he was just grateful it came out as the truth instead of eating me alive. I told him I was grateful too, and that I never wanted to keep that kind of secret again. Not from him, not from anyone. He squeezed my hand and said, "Good, because from now on, we carried things together or not at all." By our 4th counseling session, Wesley and I had made some progress, but we hit a wall during one discussion. The counselor asked Wesley what was holding him back from fully trusting again. He got quiet for a long time, and then finally admitted he'd been struggling with feeling like a fool. He said everyone must think he was stupid for not seeing through Vivian's lies sooner. The counselor leaned forward and told him that being manipulated by a sustained campaign of lies doesn't make him stupid. She explained that Vivian had been deliberately and systematically working to destroy his confidence over more than a year. She said falling for manipulation makes him human, not foolish, especially when it came from family he was supposed to trust. Wesley started crying, and I reached over to hold his hand. That session felt like a real breakthrough because he'd been carrying that shame silently. At the end of that same session, the counselor turned to me and asked if there was anything I felt guilty about. I hesitated because I didn't want to admit it out loud, but finally, I confessed that part of me had enjoyed threatening Vivian with what she did to Dad. I said I felt guilty about using what felt like blackmail, even though she deserved consequences for what she'd done. The counselor nodded and said it was completely okay to have complicated feelings about standing up for yourself. She told me that using information to protect my family from ongoing harm wasn't the same as blackmail for personal gain. She said I could acknowledge that standing up to Vivian felt good, while also recognizing it wasn't my proudest moment. That helped me feel less conflicted about the whole confrontation. The next week, my mom showed up on Tuesday morning with grocery bags and a determined look on her face. She said she'd be coming over every Tuesday from now on to spend time with Nora and help around the house. I started to protest, but she held up her hand and told me she needed to do this. She unpacked the groceries while Nora played with blocks on the kitchen floor. Mom picked up Nora and sat on the couch with her, just watching her stack the blocks and knock them down. After about 20 minutes of this, Mom looked at me and said she'd been thinking a lot about Vivian's comments from the very beginning. She admitted she told me to just ignore Vivian at that first gathering when Nora was only 3 weeks old. Mom said she wished she had shut Vivian down harder right from the start instead of treating it like harmless family nonsense. She told me she'd spent years trying to keep peace in the family by minimizing problems, and she was done with that approach. I sat down next to her and told her I understood why she'd reacted that way. Mom shook her head and said understanding didn't make it right and she should have protected me and Wesley better. She came back the following Tuesday and every Tuesday after that. Sometimes she'd bring lunch. Sometimes she'd just play with Nora while I caught up on laundry or took a shower without rushing. It became this steady thing I could count on. 2 weeks after Mom started her Tuesday visits, Denise called Wesley and asked if we'd come to dinner at their house on Saturday. Wesley asked if this was about Vivian, and Denise said yes. His whole family wanted to talk to us. I could see Wesley tense up on the couch while he listened to his mom on the phone. He told her we'd think about it and call her back. After he hung up, we sat there for a while. Finally, Wesley said he thought we should go because his family owed us an actual apology, and this seemed like they were trying to give one. I agreed but told him we'd leave the second anyone made excuses for their behavior. Saturday came and we drove to Denise's house with Nora in her car seat. Wesley's brother Grant answered the door and immediately said he was glad we came. The whole family was there in the dining room. Denise had made this big meal with Wesley's favorite foods. We all sat down and it was incredibly awkward at first, with everyone just passing dishes around in silence. Then Denise put down her fork and looked directly at both of us. She said she needed to say something formal and important. She told us that Wesley's family had failed to trust his judgment and support his marriage when he needed them most. Denise said they'd let Vivian's rumors influence them instead of believing in Wesley's character. She apologized for questioning him about paternity and for making him feel like his own mother doubted him. Grant jumped in and apologized for his comments about Nora's features and for repeating gossip instead of supporting his brother. Wesley's dad, who'd been quiet this whole time, said he was ashamed he hadn't stepped in to stop the family from piling on. The dinner lasted 3 hours and it was uncomfortable the entire time, but I could tell everyone meant what they were saying. On the drive home, Wesley said it felt necessary, even though it was painful to sit through. The following week, Mom called and asked me to meet her for coffee. I left Nora with Wesley and met Mom at the coffee shop near our house. She looked tired when I walked in. We got our drinks and sat in the corner booth. Mom told me that Vivian had been formally charged with felony theft and forgery related to Dad's estate. She said the prosecutor had looked at all the bank records and forged signatures and decided this was a serious case worth pursuing. I asked her if she was okay with her own daughter facing criminal charges. Mom was quiet for a long minute and then said she'd actually pushed for the charges to be filed. She told me Vivian needed to face real consequences, not just family disapproval and people being mad at her. Mom said that without legal consequences, Vivian would just wait for everything to blow over and then go back to her old behavior. I told her I felt conflicted about the whole legal route, even though I knew Vivian deserved punishment. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Mom said she understood my conflict, but this was bigger than just what Vivian did to my marriage. She explained that Vivian had stolen from her own dying father and forged his name while he was too weak to lift a spoon. And that was a betrayal she couldn't forgive by pretending it never happened. The charges were filed, and Vivian would have to answer for that in court. I asked if she thought Vivian would go to jail. Mom said she didn't know, but she hoped she'd at least get probation and have to pay back every dollar. Our counseling sessions continued every week, and slowly things started shifting between Wesley and me. The counselor gave us homework about rebuilding intimacy through small daily actions instead of trying to fix everything at once. Wesley took the assignment seriously. He started leaving me notes in random places around the house. I'd find them in my coat pocket or tucked into the bathroom mirror or stuck to the coffee maker. The notes would say things like why he loved me or what he appreciated about me that day. One note said he loved how patient I was with Nora, even when I was exhausted. Another said he was grateful I'd fought for our family when he'd been too beaten down to fight himself. I made an effort to be more open about my feelings, instead of trying to handle everything alone like I usually did. When I felt overwhelmed, I told him, instead of just pushing through. When I was scared about the Vivian situation, I talked to him about it instead of keeping it inside. The counselor said these small changes were building new patterns of trust and communication. It felt awkward at first because we'd gotten so used to just surviving and managing crises, but after a few weeks, it started feeling more natural. Wesley would ask me how I was really doing, and I'd actually tell him the truth. I'd ask him what he needed from me, and he'd be honest about it. We were learning how to be a team again instead of two people just trying to get through each day. Around the same time, I found out Vivian hadn't stopped fighting. She'd started calling relatives one by one, telling them a completely rewritten version of events. In her version, Dad had begged her to manage his money because I was too busy with my new baby to help, and she'd only taken what he wanted her to have. In her version, I'd found some innocent paperwork and twisted it into a crime because I was jealous and vindictive and wanted to punish her for a few harmless jokes. She was good at it. She'd cry on the phone, her voice cracking in all the right places, and a couple of relatives who didn't know the details started to wonder if maybe there were two sides to the story. Paige called me the night she found out and told me what Vivian was doing. She said two of our cousins had asked her carefully whether it was possible I'd overreacted. I felt the ground tilt under me. It wasn't enough that Vivian had spent a year attacking my marriage and stealing from our dying father. Now she was trying to rewrite herself as the victim, and some people were listening. I called Roland in a panic and told him what was happening. He was quiet for a second, and then he said something that steadied me. He said the difference between me and Vivian was that I had proof and she had a story, and stories fall apart under paperwork. He said, let her call whoever she wanted, because the moment the court documents became public, every relative who'd been leaning toward her side would remember which one of us had been telling the truth the whole time. He was right. But it still hurt to know that people I'd grown up with could hear that my sister forged our father's signature and still wonder if I was the problem. The next counseling session, I brought all of it into the room. I told the counselor I felt like I was going crazy, like the truth didn't matter because Vivian could always talk faster and cry harder and make herself the wounded one. The counselor listened and then asked me a question I hadn't expected. She asked whether I needed the relatives to believe me in order to know I'd done the right thing. I sat with that for a long moment. I said no, but it would feel better. She nodded and said that was the trap Vivian had been keeping me in for over a year. The belief that I couldn't be at peace until everyone agreed with me. She said the paperwork would speak for itself in time, but my peace couldn't wait on other people's opinions, or it would never come. Wesley reached over and held my hand while she talked, and I realized he understood exactly what she meant, because he'd spent months waiting for a piece of paper to tell him something his heart already knew. That session shifted something in me. I stopped checking to see who Vivian had called. I stopped rehearsing arguments in my head for the next time a cousin looked at me sideways. I let the documents do the work. A few weeks later, there was a hearing, mostly procedural, where Vivian entered her initial plea. Mom went and Roland went, but I stayed home with Nora because I didn't want to see her face across a courtroom. Mom called me afterward and told me what it was like. She said Vivian had shown up in a nice blazer with her lawyer, looking composed right up until the judge read the charges out loud. The forgery of a signature belonging to a dying man, the theft from an estate, the falsified insurance document. Mom said that when the words were spoken in that flat official voice with a stenographer typing every one of them down, Vivian's face changed. The composed mask slipped, and for just a second, Mom saw something like fear underneath it. She said it was the first time she'd ever seen Vivian look afraid of anything. Mom said she'd raised both of us, and she'd spent her whole life making excuses for Vivian, telling herself that Vivian was just strong-willed, just dramatic, just going through a hard time. And sitting in that courtroom hearing the charges read aloud, she realized she'd been making excuses for a person who was capable of forging her own dying father's name. She said she cried the whole drive home, not because she felt sorry for Vivian, but because she finally understood who Vivian actually was, and she grieved for the daughter she thought she had. When Mom told me all of this on the phone, I didn't know what to say. I'd spent so long being angry at Vivian that I'd forgotten Mom was losing a child in a way, watching her daughter become someone she didn't recognize. I told Mom I was sorry she had to go through that, and she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Don't you dare apologize for this. You didn't do anything except tell the truth. And I should have been protecting you and Nora from the very first joke instead of telling you to rise above it." She said, "The person who broke this family was Vivian, and she wasn't going to let anyone rewrite that, especially not Vivian herself." After that, the relatives who'd been leaning toward Vivian's side went quiet. I don't know exactly what changed their minds, whether it was the hearing or Mom or just time, but the phone calls asking if I'd overreacted stopped. One of the cousins who'd questioned Paige sent me a short text a week later that just said she was sorry and she should have known better. I didn't respond right away, but I saved it. Meanwhile, the betting pool kept surfacing in small, painful ways. It turned out that one of the relatives who'd put money in it had actually kept a running tally in her phone, dates and amounts, like it was a fantasy sports league instead of my life. When that came out, even some of the people who had defended the pool as harmless fun went silent. An aunt who'd been in it showed up at Mom's Tuesday visit one week, clearly hoping to run into me, and when I walked in, she started apologizing before I'd even taken my coat off. She said she'd lost sleep over it, that she kept imagining how she'd feel if someone had bet money on her own marriage failing while she was up at night with a newborn. I let her talk. I didn't make it easy for her, but I didn't throw her out either. I told her that the thing that hurt most wasn't the money. It was that people who claimed to love me had treated the worst year of my life like entertainment. She started to cry and said she understood, and that she'd carry the shame of it for a long time. I told her that was probably the right thing to carry. Wesley, meanwhile, kept leaving his notes. One morning, I found one folded into my shoe by the front door, and it said he was sorry it took him so long to see clearly, and that he'd spend the rest of his life making sure I never felt alone in a fight again. I kept that one in my wallet. In our next session, the counselor asked us both to name one thing the whole ordeal had taught us. Wesley said he'd learned that staying quiet to keep the peace wasn't kindness. It was cowardice, dressed up as patience, and that his silence had hurt me more than Vivian's words ever could. I said I'd learned that protecting my family sometimes meant being the villain in someone else's story, and that I could live with being Vivian's villain if it meant Nora grew up safe. The counselor said those were the kinds of lessons people usually spent years in therapy trying to reach, and we'd been forced to learn them all at once in the hardest way possible. About a month later, Roland called with an update on the case. The prosecutor had added a second forgery charge after a handwriting expert examined the beneficiary form and confirmed the signature was traced. He said the expert report was damning, and the district attorney's office felt confident. Vivian's lawyer had reached out about a possible plea deal to avoid a trial. Roland asked how I felt about that, and I told him I just wanted it over with. That I didn't want to sit in a courtroom and relive Dad's last months. He said Mom felt the same way. He told me that whatever happened, Vivian would end up with a criminal record, and that was the part that mattered because it would follow her, and it couldn't be laughed off as a joke. A few days after that, one of the relatives who'd been in the betting pool showed up at my door with a casserole and a card. She stood on the porch looking nervous and said she couldn't stop thinking about what she'd done. She said she'd told herself it was harmless fun at the time, but hearing me lay it all out at the party had made her physically sick with shame. I let her stand there and say her piece. I didn't invite her in, but I took the card and told her I appreciated her coming in person instead of hiding behind a text. She started to cry and said she understood if I never wanted to speak to her again. I told her I wasn't there yet, but that showing up mattered more than she knew. She nodded and left, and I closed the door, feeling that same tangle of anger and exhaustion I'd been living with for months. 3 months after the birthday party confrontation, Mom called with news about Vivian's case. She'd taken a plea deal and pleaded guilty. Instead of going to trial on the full felony charges, she'd admitted guilt in exchange for a reduced sentence. Vivian got 3 years probation, had to pay full restitution of the $71,000 she'd stolen from Dad, and had to complete 250 hours of community service. Mom said the guilty plea was what really mattered because it created an official record that Vivian had forged her dying father's name and stolen from him. I asked if she'd talked to Vivian at all. Mom said no, and she didn't plan to anytime soon. She told me Vivian's daughter had called her crying and begging her to forgive her mother. But Mom told her that forgiveness would take a long time, and Vivian needed to focus on paying back what she stole first. The plea deal meant no trial, which was a relief because none of us wanted to testify in court about Dad's final months. But it also meant Vivian had admitted in an official legal setting in writing that she'd stolen from our father while he was dying. That admission felt important somehow, like it made everything real and documented instead of just family drama. The paperwork from the court arrived at Mom's house a couple weeks later, and she made a copy and gave it to me. It was a single page with the case number and Vivian's name and the words guilty plea entered right there in the middle in plain black type. It listed the charges, the restitution amount, and the probation terms. I stood in my kitchen holding that page for a long time. For a year, Vivian had called it a joke. She'd waved her hand and told everyone I was too sensitive, that I couldn't take a little teasing, that my marriage deserved to fall apart if it was that weak. She'd wrapped a DNA kit in baby and set it on the Thanksgiving table like a punchline. She'd made my husband lie awake at night staring at our daughter's blue eyes. And now there was a piece of paper with her name on it, with the word guilty printed right below it, and no wink or laugh or excuse could make that go away. Wesley came into the kitchen and saw me standing there with the page in my hand. He took it from me and read it slowly all the way to the bottom. Then he walked down the hall to Nora's room and I followed him. He took the framed DNA test down from the wall and he hung the court paper right next to it, lining up the frames so they sat even. He stepped back and looked at the two of them, hanging there together over the growth chart. The proof that Nora was his and the proof that Vivian was a thief side by side. Nora was in her crib watching us with those bright blue eyes, and Wesley reached down and lifted her out and held her against his chest. He didn't say anything. He just stood there in the middle of the nursery holding our daughter and looking at those two frames on the wall, and for the first time in over a year, there was not a single question left in his eyes.